Good morning, everyone, or is it afternoon? We are very excited about our event today. Thank you for joining. I'm Margot Brooks Carthon, Professor of Nursing and Director for the Barbara Bates Center for the Study of the History of Nursing. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the Bates Center Annual Spring Spotlight event, featuring not only one, but two extraordinary guests. First, Maria Smilios, author of The Black Angels, The Untold Story of the Nurses Who Helped Cure Tuberculosis. And we are also joined by the one and only Miss Virginia Allen, who at 93 years young is one of the last living Black angels. Today you will hear more from both of our speakers about the heroics of the Black angels who, in the face of racism and horrific conditions, demonstrated compassion and bravery during the height of the tuberculosis crisis. In sum, tuberculosis killed 5.6 million US residents between 1900 and 1950, ravaging the public's health. In New York City alone, the disease killed 10,000 people annually before the city opened a sanatorium on Staten Island called Seaview Hospital, where in those days, tuberculosis patients would find sunlight, fresh air, and plenty of rest, the standard treatment for the disease at the time. Much of this care was provided by Miss Virginia Allen and her contemporaries, affectionately known as the Black Angels. Today, we will hear first from Miss Virginia Allen, who is a nurse, labor relations advocate, and social activist, and one of the last living members of the group that became the Black Angels. Miss Allen has been bestowed with far too many honors to recount, but notably in 2024 was presented with the Lifetime Legacy Award from the American Academy of Nursing, where I was pleased and honored to be present to see and hear her accept her award. Next, we will hear from Maria Smilios. Maria is an award-winning author, keynote speaker, and an adjunct lecturer at Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health. She was born and raised in New York City. She holds a Master's of Arts in American Literature from Boston University. Her work has appeared in The Guardian, The Forward, Writer's Digest, The Emancipator, Newsweek, and many other publications. And for her work with Black Angels, she won the 2024 Christopher Award in Literature, which celebrates work that affirms the highest values of the human spirit. And it is my great honor to have both of them with us today at our spotlight. We will begin with Miss Virginia Allen, who will share remarks, followed by Maria, with time in the end from questions from our audience, which we will take in the chat. So with that, and without further ado, I present to you Miss Virginia Allen.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, we did plan for Maria to go first today, so we're just gonna proceed with Maria and then look forward to hearing from Virginia.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm going to try and share my screen. And if that doesn't work, then I'm going to have, okay, so there seems to be a glitch here that the screen sharing is paused. So if you hear me say slide, it's because I'm just alerting Jessica to change the slides because she has the slideshow on the other side. So I just want to thank UPenn and the Barbara Bates Center for inviting me to talk about the book, The Black Angels. The Black Angels is a story about many things: health inequities, stigmas, sickness, systemic and institutional racism. But at its heart, it's about an exceptional group of women whose narrative, now with the rise of anti-science and misinformation and the desire to scrub history, is as relevant, if not more, as it was almost 100 years ago. Those who are familiar with the story of the Black Angels know that, or with tuberculosis actually, because a lot of people are not familiar with the story, know that February 20th, 1952, the cure for tuberculosis was announced on the front pages of the New York Post at Seaview Hospital. But what many didn't know was the story behind the story, the one about the Black nurses that until little over a year ago existed only in the memories of their family. Like so many stories, theirs begins with a serendipitous moment, a twinkling in the universe where things seem to be aligning for a single purpose, to bring certain people together for something world-changing. On a gray day in May 1929 in the Bronx, Arthur, a 55-year-old man, lay in his home, wasted and wheezing. His wife and 16-year-old son sat bedside, feeling the mist from a rain that blew through the open window, bringing an earthy scent, dulling the smell of disease that for years had permeated the air. The boy moved closer to his father, the man he loved most in the world, and watched as his chest rose and fell, and the distance between each rasping breath grew and grew until it finally stopped, ending 6 years of torment from laryngeal tuberculosis, a monstrous form of the disease, the boy would later say. 2 days later, this boy buried his father at Woodlawn Cemetery. Slide. And then he went home and tumbled into a grief so deep and vast and powerful that it would alter the course of his life. Eventually, this boy would become the man many of you know, slide, Dr. Edward Robichek. As young Robichek mourned his father, trying to understand this loss, 12 miles away at City Hall, the Commissioner of Health was mired in a crisis of his own. Suddenly, inexorably, the white nurses at Seaview Hospital began quitting. One by one, they hung up their uniforms and walked out. Their reasons varied. Some cited the 5-hour commute, the successive days of 12 and 14-hour shifts. Others said it was the mental and physical toll their job demanded, but most were leaving to escape tuberculosis, the great white plague, slide, the robber of youth, and its victims, the quote, infected, incurable, indigent, un-American consumptives. That's who came to Seaview Hospital, New York's largest municipal sanatorium. Slide. On its floors, hundreds of patients lay, slide, in iron-framed beds, languishing, their bodies teeming with millions of arrogant microbes that gnawed at their lungs, slide, kidneys and tongues, their spines and bones and brains. All day long, they sweated and groaned and cried out. They coughed and choked and spit up blood, each hack sending swarms of live germs onto bedpans and sheets, tables, chairs, and doorknobs. The bacteria landed on walls and nightstands and window shades. It drifted under beds and down hallways, slinking into every corner of the room and the ward. It was always present, prowling, lingering, waiting to strike anyone who wasn't already sick, and all it took was a single inhalation. For years, the nurses had watched their colleagues fall ill. They saw how their faces turned ashen, how their eyes burned, slide, from a fever that climbed and climbed, and how their skin exuded a sickly odor that no amount of washing could eradicate. Some recovered, at least temporarily. Others died in the wards where they once worked. In those early days of 1929, before the crash, the city thrummed and churned and grew, giving white working women plenty of options for jobs that would not kill them. They could work as sales clerks, cashiers, stenographers, librarians, and telephone operators who could work the switchboard at the New York Telephone Company's new headquarters, a soaring Art Deco skyscraper, the exact opposite of the dark and sprawling Seaview. Since the 1900s, tuberculosis had plagued the city, finding willing hosts in the waves of immigrants who arrived from all over Europe and found lodging in the Lower East Side tenements. City officials like Dr. Herman Biggs despised these buildings that journalist Jacob Riis dubbed, quote, fever-breeding structures. But more so, he despised the people who lived in them. Slide. For years, Biggs had spearheaded an effort to control the spread of TB through various measures. Tent colonies, slide, disease maps, registration laws, slide, posters, and even a health clown named Choo Choo, slide, who along with his health dog sidekick Cremo sang ditties about bathing, drinking milk, and opening windows to children living in the slums. When those failed, Biggs grew desperate and implored the city to build a hospital as a, quote, necessary protection for those who don't have tuberculosis but are exposed to it by the carelessness of others, end quote. The city obliged and in 1913 opened Seaview. Within 2 days, it reached its original capacity of housing 800 sick people. By 1920, Seaview had helped the annual death rate in New York City drop by almost half, from 10,000 to a little more than 5,000. But there it stalled. Now, at the end of the 1920s, the nurses were leaving the dream hospital, and Seaview's triumph had become the commissioner's nightmare. Slide. Tuberculosis remained the third leading killer in the great metropolis and the fourth globally. Sending patients to other hospitals was impossible. They were all full. If the commissioner couldn't find nurses to staff Seaview, he would be forced to close wards, and hundreds of highly contagious TB patients would converge on the city, their coughs and phlegm flinging active bacilli into the air like confetti. Infection rates would rise, and decades of progress would be reversed. The commissioner would not let Seaview close, not on his watch, he said. Emergency meetings ensued, and an idea emerged. The city would issue a hiring call across the South, one similar to those made by recruiters who swayed Black sharecroppers and farmers to leave and come north and work in slaughterhouses, steel mills, and factories. Across the country, hundreds of Black nurses were qualified, yet or underemployed because of segregation. The city would offer them a package, free schooling if necessary at Harlem Hospital, housing, a salary, and above all, as they sought, a, quote, rare opportunity to work at one of the city's integrated municipal hospitals. At the time, only 4 of New York's 29 hospitals employed Black nurses. The call went out. Advertisements appeared in Black newspapers and on church bulletin boards. Recruiters from New York showed up at historically Black colleges, and soon Black student nurses read about the chance for a career in New York City. News spread by word of mouth, moving down the eastern seaboard across the Mason-Dixon line, through Virginia, Tennessee, the Carolinas, and deeper into the American South. It didn't take long before the nurses began coming, packing up their lives and dreams, and leaving southern cities and rural towns. Alone, they boarded Jim Crow trains and buses and headed north. In talking to the families over 8 years, I heard how these women were determined to rise above the math that said Black women can't have professional careers or own homes, how the burning desire to heed their calling of caring for those who were left to die and to live a life free from the daily constraints of segregation. Slide. The back doors, the yes sirs, the colored fountains, the waiting areas, the sidewalk rules, the violence, and whatever else white men had dreamt up and made into law roused them to come. These were the yearnings that led them to the wards of a sanatorium, to work with one of the deadliest diseases during one of the most dreadful times in human history. The pre-antibiotic days of the Great Depression that unfolded alongside a country entrenched in the virulency of Jim Crow. But they believed this was their ticket to freedom. During the 1930s and 40s, hundreds of women answered the call, far too many to fit into a single book. But I want to give you a glance at one of them, and then you will hear from another one. Slide. The call arrived in Savannah, Georgia, one sweltering August day in 1929, 3 months into young Robichek's mourning. It came to 28-year-old Edna Sutton like a reverie, a glorious invitation that reawakened her waning dream of becoming a surgeon or a nurse. Born in 1900 on the floor of a tar paper shack in one of Savannah's shanty towns, such dreams, people said, were considered fanciful, lofty, outrageous. Black women in Savannah rarely left menial jobs in their city, let alone become surgeons in the North. But Edna's father, Slide, an enslaved man, had inspired his daughter. In 1899, he walked off his plantation in Confederate Wilkes County, Georgia, arrived in Savannah, and reinvented himself as a preacher. Dream big, he had taught her. Edna's dreams reached the stars. After high school, Edna enrolled in one of Savannah's 2 Black training schools for nurses, the Georgia Infirmary, Slide, a small charity hospital that relied on donations and student labor to stay open. It was considered a godforsaken place that strained to serve 1,800 impoverished people a year, a burden that fell on Edna and her fellow trainees, who assisted a small staff of overworked nurses. In addition to taking vitals, learning wound care, assisting in procedures, the nurses also mopped and cleaned bathrooms, changed bed linens, and laundered clothes. Despite all the issues, the long hours and lack of supplies, many times there weren't enough shrouds to bury the dead, Edna loved her job. In the words of her family, she had found her calling. But after 2 years of training, the school let her go, and Edna joined the hundreds of Black nurses who were unemployed and whose dreams were thwarted because the same country that drew lines around water fountains and bus stations also drew them around hospitals. So at the time, Black nurses were only allowed to work in Black hospitals. In America, there were only 260 Black hospitals versus 6,000 white hospitals. And despite the white hospitals being underemployed, they still refused to hire Black nurses. So Edna spent years working as a clerk and taking care of her younger sister, 20 years her junior, Americus, who was the woman sitting next to her in the previous slide. And then one August day, she learned about Seaview and applied, because what Edna wanted most in her life was a professional career, one that would allow her to pursue her dream of medicine and make enough money to buy a house in a place where she didn't have to look at those signs telling her where she could sit, where she could walk, where she could go to school, a place where her younger sister would have opportunities that she could only ever imagine. Seaview, she believed, was that place. Slide. After a year at Harlem Hospital, Edna began working as a post-operative nurse in Seaview's surgical ward. One of the things I want to point out in this photograph is that if you notice there's no overhead surgical lights, all surgery at the time until the mid-1930s was done by the whims of the sun that came in through that curved window. And then sometime in the mid-1930s, Seaview got the rolling overhead lights, and then eventually the operating room would be updated. But when she first arrived, this is the kind of room she would have worked in. For years, Edna listened to patients who asked about the operations with terrifying names: thoracoplasty, lobectomy, and frenetic nerve crush. Slide. And then tried to quell their anxiety about dying. Day in, day and night, Edna and her colleagues were tasked to sit with the dying and watch as tuberculosis exacted its price. In one man, the disease had pulverized his lungs, nearly liquefying them. As he lay dying, coughing up blood and clumps of mucus, it was Edna who stayed through the night, placing ice chips on his lips and telling him things were all right, even though they weren't. In the morning, when the sun above Staten Island glowed red, his body finally shut down, ending his torment. Nights like these were par for the course, and Edna and her colleagues quickly came to realize that few places were darker than Seaview. But until there was a better treatment or a cure for tuberculosis, this is where she and they were called. Slide. To this island, this hospital, and these people that the city had damned. There were many others like Edna who committed themselves to caring for the sick and destitute people of New York City. Slide. Clemmy Phillips, Virginia Green, Curleen Jennings Bennett, Leola Washington, and Misuria Luvino Meadows Walker, who arrived via Howard University, determined to put down new roots and advocate for the integration of Black nurses into the American Nurses Association. And then there was also Miss Virginia Allen, who, as you heard, at 93, is one of the last living Black angels. Slide. And who you will hear about, and who you will hear from very, very soon. She's the niece of Edna, and she came in 1947 during a dire nurse shortage set off by the war. She was 16, and she began working in the Children's Hospital, whose hollowed-out remains now stand in a jumble of dense forest. Slide. Back then, people said its floors were filled with 250 children. And many said it was, quote, the saddest place in the world, a place where the disease reared itself in uglier ways. Slide. In the rows of cribs and beds, in the walkers and wheelchairs, in the children's toys that lay strewn on blankets. or tossed under beds or around the room. It arrived in the dissonance of noise and sounds, crying, screaming, moaning. For the nurses, comforting them was difficult. They were fussy and wheezy and irritable. Some threw things, food, toys, pillows, and snivelled for hours. A good handful fumed. Their faces and necks turned red and their fingers clenched into small fists. They shouted and thrashed and threw long-lasting tantrums. Slide. In the daily logbook, the nurses chronicled the days. Sorry, there's a that logbook is from 1945. I made a mistake there. In the daily logbook, the nurses chronicled the days. Quote, Anthony quite miserable, Ruth listless and helpless, Bobby many lesions on face crusted over, Andrew appears partially paralyzed. Slide. And on went the somber, evolving narrative. When women like Edna and Missouri and Virginia came to Seaview, no one told them that here, people were sicker than anyone should be allowed to become sick, that here people remained for years. Slide. Slide. I looked at hundreds of medical cards that told the story, length of stay, 465 days, 627 days. One read 1,019 days, over 3 straight years at Seaview. For these people, time fell away. They became desperate and depressed, and their voices became laced with a dark and faded bitterness, a resignation reserved only for the gravely ill and only for places like this, where life was lived in the shadow of death, and where the nurses became mediators who constantly straddled the world of the living and the world of the dying. And all the while, slide, they dealt with the institution, personified by their supervisor, Miss Lorna Doone Mitchell, a Teutonic white woman, the daughter of a Confederate medic, who wielded her power in perverse ways, lurking in hallways, hoping to catch them doing something wrong, refusing requests for transfers, and preventing them from wearing masks on a regular basis. Masks, she said, made them complacent. According to one nurse, she had a gaze that could, quote, freeze the devil himself. And then there was the racist version of some city officials that nurses, these nurses, were simply expendable. In 1933, at a meeting in New York City with over 300 nurses, city officials, and supervisors, a young nurse, Solaria Key, was in the audience. And the president of hospitals was talking, and she stood up. She was about not even 5'2", in this room full of people, and asked, Mr. President, why do you send Black nurses to Seaview Hospital? And he said, quote, we send Black nurses to Seaview because in 20 years, we won't have a colored problem in America because they'll all be dead from tuberculosis. But they didn't die. Instead, in the face of such impediments, they persisted, giving us the ending we all know. The one beginning on February 20th, when the New York Post prematurely broke the news about a cure, slide, by carrying the banner headline, Wonder Drug Fights TB, and in a single galvanizing moment changed the course of history. It was triumphant, and as Dr. Robichek later said, quote, none of it would have been possible without these Black nurses, end quote. But then no one cared about the nurses or their story. Slide. If you look closely at the most iconic picture taken from that day, this is a photograph that it was global, and in today's world, we would say it went viral. And it was taken by a very famous photographer, Nat Fine, who also photographed the bowing out of Babe Ruth. As you can see, the once incurables are front and center jitterbugging. In the back stand the Black nurses, their faces staid and somber. They tell a different story, a more complex one of women who saw terrible things, slide, who in these buildings did the impossible, prevail over humanity's greatest scourge, tuberculosis, slide, who followed orders from physicians who themselves were at a loss, working through trial and error, and preaching unreliable medications that often made people sicker, who stood in surgical rooms, slide, watching operations turn to butchery, ribs being sawed off in bushels 6 to 8 at a time, chest cavities being punctured and opened and stuffed with ping pong balls, wax packs, and fat to collapse the lungs. They did it because it was their job, because they had committed themselves to saving lives at the risk of their own, but also because they were Black women, subjects of Jim Crow's labor laws that offered them few, if any, options. I want to believe that we have moved far away from many aspects of this story, but I fear, especially now, and in the coming years, we have not. We still have a lot of work to do. Slide. Slide. Oops. Slide. That's it. In graduate school, I studied with Elie Wiesel, an Auschwitz survivor, who talked in depth about what it meant to bear witness, what moral obligations we as human beings had to each other when we heard or read a story or witnessed something that was unjust. His class changed me and the decisions of how I wanted to live my life. When I learned about this story, I couldn't turn away from the injustices and inaccuracy of history. And so I spent almost a decade making sure it was told. Many times I wanted to quit. And in those moments, I needed to remind myself of why I was writing, to give voice to these people who were silenced, to the patients who were seen as immoral, uncouth, and unworthy of decent care or any care at all, and to the nurses who, because of their skin color, were also seen as unworthy and expendable. Can you go back one slide? That. Last week, this photograph was posted. It's the inside of the NIH hallways. It's the before and after. So that's the before. You can see that there are photographs there. And then this is the after that was posted on February 8th. I sat for a long time looking at the photograph and thinking of the implications of removing history, which are vast and far too many to touch on right now. And I'm sure all of us can talk in great depth about how we feel. Of course, I couldn't help but think about the Black angels who had been erased from history for 80 years. And because of that, there had been an entire narrative about tuberculosis and the cure crafted and circulated without them. Over the years that I was writing this book, some people expressed sadness that they weren't part of the history. Others expressed outrage, but almost everyone expressed gratitude that finally history would be righted. And now we stand at a moment when so much of history is in jeopardy of vanishing, including this one. On a regular basis, I receive emails from people telling me that my, quote, woke book won't matter anymore, that it will be erased, that their aunt worked alongside the Black angels, and it's not true that there was racism. I ignore them. Some history might be erased, but it's up to us to ensure that these women and this history remains, that if we have heard this story, that we make sure it is, that we continue to tell it. So if there's one thing I ask is please remember that history matters, this one matters. And yes, the story of the Black angels is heartbreaking and many times infuriating, but ultimately it is a story of triumph, of humanity, one that reminds us there will always be people like you and like them who selflessly commit themselves to working on the front lines of medicine. I can't help but think of the nurses who work during COVID or who work every day, actually. And mostly it's a story about women who found the will, the determination to make the world a better place, one where equity and compassion, morality and love and bearing witness would become the guiding principles. Please, I ask you to ensure that this story will continue to remain as part of the tuberculosis narrative and nursing narrative and Black history and women's history. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Beautiful. I know that there will be many, many comments, which we will take once we hear from Ms. Allen. Thank you for your beautiful presentation.
Thank you.
Ms. Allen.
Good morning, and thank you so much for inviting me here today. This is February, Black History Month. In 1915, historian Carter B. Woodson co-founded the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, paving the way for Black History Month, initially celebrated as Negro History Month Week in 1926. It evolved into a month-long celebration in 1976, recognizing the remembrance and remarkable achievements of Black Americans. February was chosen for Black History Month because it includes the birthdays of abolitionist Frederick Douglass and President Abraham Lincoln, who led the U.S. through the Civil War. 90 years later, Black History Month continues to inspire and empower, serving as a testament to the transformative power of knowledge and celebration. Nursing has been my life for the past 68 years, and I have immense love and respect for this profession. My daughter followed in my footsteps, becoming a registered nurse. Though I lost her to a heart attack in 2002, she, like so many others in this field, was dedicated to caring for others. To build a better future, we must understand the past. There has been a growing interest in the history of the Black Angels, a group of Black nurses, including myself, who worked with tuberculosis patients at Seaview Hospital during the epidemic. I see a parallel between that time and the COVID-19 pandemic, as nurses once again stood on the front lines caring for isolated patients, comforting families in their last moments. COVID-19 and the tuberculosis epidemic both took thousands of lives daily, but it took decades to find a cure for tuberculosis. And during my early career, the profession was only just learning how to effectively treat and slow the spread of the disease due to the clinical trials that were developed by Dr. Robichek and Silikoff and others at Seaview. Advances in medicine are rarely the work of a single person. They are the result of many people coming together. The stories of women and people of color, often overlooked in the past, are now gaining recognition. And I'm grateful to tell you that story. And I hope it inspires others to pursue excellence in nursing and treat every patient as if they were family. I am 93 years old, and in many ways, I represent nursing past. I was born in 1931, and at the age of 16, I moved from Detroit, Michigan to Staten Island to live with my Aunt Edna Sutton Ballard, a registered nurse, She worked at Seaview Hospital for 38 years. And it was her example that led me to become a nurse. She was like a second mother to me. When I started out, I didn't have my eyes on making medical history. I actually was not even fully aware of the risk I was taking in working with patients and with a deadly disease.
Call from K-Tech.
Excuse me.
Call from K-Tech.
I'll call you back. I'm on a Zoom meeting. When I started, I didn't have my eyes on making medical history. I actually was not even fully aware of the risk I was taking in working with patients with a deadly and highly contagious disease. The Black Angels were recruited largely from the Jim Crow South to work with tuberculosis patients at Seaview Hospital after white nurses transferred or quit rather than work there. Almost all the hospitals in New York were still segregated. And I saw the job as an opportunity to get paid to do what I loved and what I was called to do. It was my first job, and it felt like a dream come true. And at that time, I didn't realize I was only making pennies. Nurses back then were highly professional, but we weren't recognized or respected as such. We didn't have the pay, benefits, or workplace protections we have today. And it wasn't until nurses began unionizing that conditions improved and nursing became a more stable career. While our profession has made significant progress, we still struggle for the respect, especially nurses of color. After I took my boards, I worked in the operating room of Brooklyn Jewish Hospital, which had a renowned heart unit for children. Later, at Staten Island University Hospital, I assisted in complex surgeries, including thoracic and neurosurgeries. And in the 60s, I took a break from nursing to study labor relations at Cornell University, recognizing we need a strong union voice to advocate for patients and our profession. At that time, being involved in unions was not always seen as professional, but I believed it was necessary. I fought for many of the positive changes we enjoy now. Through the nursing profession has evolved with more advanced practice roles and technological advancements. The heart of nursing, our dedication to caring for our patients, remains the same. Our profession has grown, but the core values of compassion, integrity, and respect for our colleagues hasn't changed. That is the essence of nursing that we must carry forward. While techniques and treatments may evolve, what truly matters is the care and connection we provide to our patients and their families. That human touch is invaluable. It's something no price tag can capture. Despite the attempts of the healthcare corporations to commodify every aspect of care, though I'm not at the bedside anymore, I'm still involved in advocating for the profession and my community. Nursing is a lifelong commitment, and you can continue to make a difference even after you leave the hospital. Volunteering and community service are also vital ways to improve people's lives. I urge you to keep advocating for safe staffing and patient care. Use your voice and power. Nurses never give up. The challenges we face may seem overwhelming, but history has shown that we can overcome anything with time, patience, and perseverance. In closing, I would like to share a few words from the Mary Stewart prayer, which feels as relevant today as it did when it was written in 1921. Let us take time for all things and make us grow calm, serene, and gentle. Teach us to put into action our better impulses, to be straightforward and unafraid. Grant that we may realize that it is the little things of life that creates differences, and that in the big things of life, we are one. And may we strive to touch and to know the great common heart of us all. And oh Lord, let us forget not to be kind. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
So I just wanted to extend a warm thank you to you, Ms. Allen, for your words, for your reminders, for your memories. We're so grateful. And to Maria as well. And I'd like to invite her to come back on video. The next portion of our time together is going to be moderated by the Bates Center curator, Jessica Martucci. And so if you have questions, you can offer them in the Q&A. They're not anonymous, so you can put your questions in the Q&A. Jessica will read them aloud to our guest speakers. Jessica.
Thank you, Margot, and thank you again, Ms. Allen and Maria, for being here today. There are a few questions that have come in. So actually one of them is sort of a comment for Virginia Allen from Susan Schwartz, who says, Ms. Allen, thank you for your courage and care. My grandmother was hospitalized at Seaview in the early 50s, and you may very well have cared for her. I would like to think so because she was so inspired by the nurses through years of quarantine that she encouraged her grandchildren to become nurses. There are three of us carrying that legacy forward. So she just wanted to share that with you.
Thank you.
We also had a question for Maria about that part of your talk at the end where you showed the NIH hallway and the sort of before and after picture. And I just wondered if you wanted to say anything more about that, Maria. You're on, you're on mute.
Sorry, it was a hallway that had images of women and people of color, and apparently the Martin Luther King photograph remained up there. I've been trying to actually find out more about the hallway, but what's coming up beyond the hallway is all the stuff that's being scrubbed. So I don't know the history of that hallway, where it led, or anything like that. But I do know that there's lots of posts about the inside of the hallway. So I would be curious if anybody else found anything more about what, I guess that hallway was just like scientists, because it said it was women and people of color who were down that hallway. So
Where was that, Maria?
the National Institute of Health.
Okay.
Thank you. And I don't know if folks can see the answered questions or not, but we have one question, Maria, if you could share the source for the NIH
Oh, goodness.
hallway, or just if there's a link to that.
So it's, if you, I can't do it without getting off and going to Google it, because that photograph, I had screenshotted it. But if you, let me see if I can, yeah,
We can also send it out in
yeah,
our follow-up email to registrants.
why don't we do that? Because if you're
Okay.
not on Twitter or Blue Sky where the images are posted, so I'll do that. I'll send it to you, and then you can screenshot it and see, you know.
Great, thank you. We do have a question here for Miss Allen from Nancy Biller. She asks if you could share something about quality of life for nurses at Seaview, the type of lifestyle that their salaries could provide. And she wants to know, if there were inequities in the amount of pay that the Black nurses received from the white nurses who were there. So she's just asking for some more of your firsthand experience from working at Seaview.
While the pay was so low, I am sure there was some discrepancies in pay, because there always has been. But I can't positively attest to that. But Department of Labor lists the wages, and I think that that information could be found on that site.
And what about your experience of the living conditions and just like quality of life experiences for yourself?
It was excellent, because they couldn't treat us differently from what they were trying to offer to the patients. I had a comfortable dormitory room. I lived with my aunt for a few years in her home on Bradley Avenue. That's Edna Sutton Ballard. And then when a relative moved up from Jacksonville, Florida, to go to Hunter College, I gave up my room and moved into the nurse's residence because it was possible. And it was very comfortable. I had a private room, small but adequate, with a small bed, a closet, a very small sink, community showers and bath toilets. And I think there was a chair and a chest. And I know it was a chest, but I think there was a chair in the room. but it was always very pleasant here. It was family-like. I knew the nurses. We had a room where we could cook dinner, and we ate together. Some of the nurses on the floor. There are 4 floors. And we had entertainment in the rumpus room. There was a baby grand piano there at that time. And we had entertainment and teas. So it wasn't dreary. We did poetry and played cards. It was family oriented, even though it was a dormitory.
Jessica, could I just add something? I wanted to go back about the pay. So just to speak to that, the Black nurses were always underpaid. They were paid less than white nurses. So the records that Virginia is referring to are also a little bit strange, because when I looked up Edna's initial salary at being hired, it showed $670 a year, which was an extraordinary amount of money at that time compared to what other like domestic Black women were making. But then the following year, it shows her at 750, and then the following year she drops back down. So it's these weird discrepancies, but it seems, generally speaking, that most of the nurses, and then they were also hired by, there was no such thing as like an RN at the time. The breakdown is very interesting to look at. It's nurse, and then it's like, it says like aide and then helper. Only later did they start demarcating with degrees. So in 1936, when Missouri came up, she was coming out of an HBCU 3-year program. She was hired for almost $900, right? So it's just interesting to see those discrepancies. I just also want to say that when Virginia arrived, she was really fortunate because they had expanded the dormitory and it was really, really beautiful. But before that, before 1937, when the other nurses were there, if you look at, I had looked at the city records, it was kind of a mess. There was leaks, and so they didn't have that wonderful, like in the early 30s when they first came up. So that I just wanted to sort of let people know that that dormitory in 1937 had been expanded to add 200 more rooms. So originally it was only like 200 nurses were able to live there, which is why a lot of the initial nurses like Edna ended up getting boarding rooms in Harlem and doing this 5-hour commute.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have just another sort of comment from Nadina Day, who wanted to just say, I don't have a question, but just wanted to say how appreciative I am to experience these wonderful presentations. So just wanted to share that with you both. Cookie Burke writes, thank you for your courage. Virginia, once you saw the conditions at the hospital, did it make you hesitate just a little, being as though the disease was so deadly?
Well, at that time, at the tender age of 16, I did not realize the detriment of the disease. I was interested in becoming a nurse, and this was my first steps. So I didn't have any fear. I never had any fear. And I must say, since we're talking about wages and hours, when I did my 18-month course of study on Welfare Island, it was renamed Roosevelt Island. When I traveled there, it took 2 hours to get there and 2 hours to get back. And then I had to work because it was a work-study program. after getting up at 6 a.m. to be at class at 9, and then getting back to Staten Island to do an afternoon shift. I actually was working more than 16 hours a day. And I scratch my head and wonder how they would allow that with the disease being so deadly. Because rest, a good diet, and relaxation would have been paramount for good health, especially for the caretakers. But I was never late and never absent for that 18 months.
Thank you.
And that's when I received my orientation to working on the adult floors. They did not assign me to the children's building where I had initially worked. I was working with the grown-ups who were much sicker than the children and the babies.
Great. Thank you, Virginia. Another question has come in from Wanda Montalvo, who asks, the history of the Black Angels seems extremely relevant to the current national landscape. What is the call to action for nurses at this time? And I don't know, Maria, do you take that for?
Sure. So I'm not a nurse, but I've spent a lot of time around nurses the last like 10 years. So I think one of the things that nurses can do, because this is part of your history, it's part of medical history, American history, is, for example, Rutgers University has integrated the book into their curriculum. All freshmen are required to read it, and in certain classes they're required to read it. So one way in this age of like book banning and hoping that like these, quote, as I get the emails, woke stories go away, is to promote the actual story of the Black Angels. I think the other, talk about it, talk about history. And, as a historian, of course, that's the kind of direction that I go. I think the other call to action would be left up to whatever other calls is probably left up to individual schools or individuals who see, how they want to continue. As I say, this is the hidden history. It's like Hidden Figures. It's just nursing. It's not NASA, and I would love nothing more than to see these women honored in a national way. I can't say it's going to happen right now, but maybe within the next, administration or some way, a national way, the way Hidden Figures is. So I would leave that up to the nursing community to uplift them in the way that they see best fit.
Do you want to add anything to that, Virginia?
I think Maria covered it well, but I also feel that we can't forget our past and we have to look forward to the future. And don't give up on your dreams.
Thank you. Let's see. We have another question coming in for Miss Allen from Megan Aaron. As a clinical trial nurse, I am very curious as to your experience working as nurse and administering a clinical trial. Did you know it was a new treatment? Were there many other drugs tested before the final treatment?
They didn't tell us that it was a trial, but we did have to document the patient's response to the drug, how well they slept, their appetite, their physical and mental well-being. And in those days, we did all our charting. By hand. voluminous notes, wherein today we have checkoff marks and computers.
Can I also jump in on that?
Yeah.
So initially, the initial trial that began in 1951, before that broke, the patients did consent to it. Maybe after, when it moved to the Children's Hospital, it was a little different. And regarding the other drugs tested before the final one, streptomycin was a big drug that had been tested for a long time across the country. And there were a few other earlier trials with sulfa medication, but all of those patients had been given, they knew they were doing drug trials. They knew that they were part of, and there were small cohorts of patients. There's one that I do cite in the book about sulfa that was done. It didn't do well because sulfa wasn't it was an antibiotic that didn't work against tuberculosis, but they tried different variations of testing it. People liked to test drugs at CVU because it had children, and then it had from like 0 babies all the way up to however old people were, men and women from different backgrounds and different ethnicities, and all different types of tuberculosis. So it was a really, a perfect place. Plus, people flew under the radar, and they were living on the margins of society. But I do want to say this was not like a Tuskegee experiment. Every single person, every document that I looked at, they knew they were being, given a specific drug.
Thank you. We have a question here from Michelle Bass, who asks, how were nurses selected in terms of working in the OR versus the children's unit? And also, how was the reception from the patients toward the Black Angels? Ms. Allen, do you want to take that?
I worked in the children's ward from the time I was hired until I went to Central School on the work-study program for nursing. Repeat your question.
I think the question, well, it's 2 questions really. The first question was, how were nurses, like, what were the decision factors in assigning a nurse to the children's unit versus a different unit?
I have no idea, but I'm glad I was assigned to the children because I was young and I could relate to them, and it was a joy to work with them. Wherein the adults, they were depressed and angry and disgruntled, not always because of their personality, but because of their illness. Some of them knew they were dying. But the children were like any other child in the community. They had a lot of energy. They were mischievous and inquisitive, and they were really lovely to work with. It was a pleasure.
And the other part of this question was about how the patients reacted to the nurses. Were the patients, I mean, you sort of got at this a little just now with saying that the adults were a little in poorer spirits than the children, but did the patients generally react positively to the nurses, or what was your experience with that?
I think they were grateful that the nurses took such good care of them. And therefore, they called the nurses their angels. And that was the beginning of that term, Black Angels, because the majority of the nurses were Black who cared for them.
Great, thank you. We have a lot of questions that have come in, and I don't know if we'll have time to address all of them. So I'm gonna start being a little picky here, and I apologize if we don't get to your question. Um, a couple of questions have come in asking about, let's see, we've got Nadina Day and Amanda Brock have both asked questions about how, if, what precautions or what kind of efforts did the nurses take to try not to get sick themselves, or was there not really an opportunity to do any of that?
We used isolation technique. And in those days, the gowns and masks were used over and over again. They were laundered, sterilized, and we used them over and over. Wherein today we use paper goods. And with the cloth, we never ran out. There was always plenty of gowns and masks. And when caring for the patients, we used gown and mask and changed in between each patient.
Maria, I don't know if you have anything you wanted to add here that you discovered through your research or.
On how they prevented being sick. No, I think Virginia answered that question. It was essentially the same thing. I also would just say that the families told me when I asked them that question that they had deep abiding faith, and it wasn't like a magical thinking that God's not going to get me sick. But I think, when you go into something believing that you are here for a purpose, so, your composition or the way you approach things, instead of with fear, with like, I'm here to do this, might change a little bit. So that's it.
Thank you. We have a question from Neville Strumpf, who says, please comment on relationships between physicians and nurses. Were physicians both white and black? And was there diversity among the patients? Were the patients white and black? And did patients receive visitors, or were they quite isolated? And there's a series of questions in there, so I'm happy to repeat those as we go along. But the first one is about what the relationships were between physicians and nurses.
At Seaview Hospital, it was a very good relations between the doctors and the nurses. Sometimes the patients themselves, due to their conditions, were not very nice, especially those who are very ill and frightened and depressed. But the relationship between the doctors and the nurses was a good one. And it was a integrated staff so far as the doctors go, and an integrated population of patients. The patients came from all over and all countries to get the cure, which at that time was only fresh air, sunshine, a very rich diet, and plenty of rest. And Seaview is located in an area where it's very high. It's the highest point between Maine and Miami. And up here, we always have swirling of air. And the patients went on these solariums winter and summer. So they were outside every day practically. And I presently live in the old nurses' residence that was renovated for senior citizens in 2009. And they did a very beautiful job of renovating this space. And we have 105 apartments here of 1 bedroom, 2 bedrooms, and studio apartments. And I must say the architects were 2 women.
Thank you, Virginia. Was there a culture of patients receiving visitors at Seaview, or were they considered, to be under quarantine?
They were under quarantine, except for the patients who were in remission, who were considered cured, but they still lived on the grounds in the, we had some cottages, and that was like a halfway house. They worked and lived in those cottages until they were completely discharged. And the cottages are still here on the grounds.
Thank you. I want to see if any of the Bates Center folks have questions, because we're getting close to the end of our time here. I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but did you
No,
want to
no,
ask
no.
any questions?
No, I do have a question, but it's actually not my question, but one I shared with Emma Max. She asked, of course, is Miss Allen. I just want to thank you for your work, both at the bedside and workforce wellness. Emma says she worked in COVID ICUs throughout the pandemic, and it was truly stories and experiences like yours that gave us as nurses hope. That being said, how did you manage feelings of burnout or despair while caring for patients at Seaview, if you experienced that at all? And so there are so many lessons that history teaches us, particularly as we've just come out of a pandemic. And so just curious about any ways that you managed your own wellness during that time.
I think because I was so young and in very good health, I had no misgivings about it. And even today, I've really remarked myself at I have 2 artificial knees, and unfortunately I had cancer of my left breast, and I have a left mastectomy. But I feel wonderful. I have no complaints. I'm not ill. I've never contracted tuberculosis. I feel that I'm enjoying good health at 93.
And we're so blessed and honored to have you. I do want to read comments by our dean, Dr. Biel, who says, we're so sorry not to have you in person. And so some of our guests will know that this was a planned hybrid event. And so we were hoping to invite both Miss Allen and Maria to Penn, but because of the inclement weather and out of an abundance of caution, we said we will make this a fully virtual event. But she says, we're so fortunate to have you on Zoom. And I share that, Maria. Thank you so much for your attention to preserving our history, Virginia, for being a living legend. So we thank you for what you've done and continue to do. Thank you for amplifying the story of the Black Angels, Maria. We're very, very grateful to both of you for sharing being our spotlight, our spring spotlight for the Bates Center. It's been a true honor to have you both. So I don't have any further questions, Jessica. I don't know if we've covered everyone, but you all have to take a look at the chat, Maria and Miss Allen, because there were so many words of inspiration that others who were able to participate. We had nearly 100 participants on today. Wow. Exactly. And so it was a lot of people got to hear your words of inspiration, and I'm so happy about that.
Thank you very much. And of course, you know there's next year.
There is next year, so we'll be in touch.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us, and thank you for pivoting it online. That was, I
Yes.
think that was, I was a little nervous, you know, because Amtrak, that corridor doesn't ever, like a flake falls. So, and thank you for everyone for your kind words and for, you know, being part of listening to this history.
Yeah.
And I am fortunate and honored to be part of this history. And thank you so much for sharing it and inviting us to share it with you.
Yeah, I think you know, we have mostly just words of gratitude and adulation in our Q&A at this point. I did have one question that I was interested in asking before we end, which has to do with how this story and this history sort of was brought to light. And I'm just curious for Miss Allen, you know, at what point do you realize that you're a history maker? You know, and at what point did you realize this is a story that I need to make sure gets heard?
Well, in 2001 or two, when Matt Titone brought us to the assembly up in Albany, I realized how important the story is. And then there was an article written in the Staten Island Advance about the Black Angels by Stevie Lacey Pendleton, which was a beauty. She really covered it well. And that's when I started realizing it was very important.
And Maria, my follow-up question for you is, you know, you mentioned that you spent 10 years researching, making sure that, you know, you got this story right. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit about what that process was. You know, how did you find all of these stories? How did you go about unearthing, you know, this hidden history?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So in short, I was working as a science editor for Springer, and I was working on a book on orphan lung diseases, and the doctor was going to test out this medication, and he made some allusion to, you know, he wanted it to work as swiftly as the cure for tuberculosis that was found at Seaview. So let me just put a little shelf here. I am the daughter of first-generation immigrants. My grandfather came from Greece, and he had tuberculosis when he came to the United States. He was not sent to Seaview. He was sent somewhere else to a hospital called Otisville. So I was like, oh, wow, tuberculosis, this is great. I had this like fascination with how disease moved through the city, particularly New York as a native New Yorker. And I Googled it and this article came up, but alongside of it was the article on Miss Virginia Allen and another nurse, I can't remember her name, who were part of this cadre of Black nurses called the Black Angels. And I was like, wow, who are these women? And I couldn't find anything on them. And I called the Staten Island Museum days later, and they were like, hey, you know, she's doing this. Miss Allen is doing this little presentation for our grand reopening. This was in 2015. So I went down there and I met her. We started talking, we started meeting. And at some point, I had started to really do a deep dive into this story that had been very, very whitewashed. You know, it was like very neatly packaged. white nurses quit, Black nurses come in, and yay, the cure is found. And I said to her, there's so much more to this story. I had also contacted Dr. Robachek's son, who had given me his dad's archives. And so she said, well, why don't you tell it? And I said, there's no archives. And she said, well, listen, I can tell you what I know, and then I can, kind of hook you up with other people in Staten Island, the families. And that's kind of how it snowballed. It came from oral history. I said, as somebody whose family is from Greece, they love oral history. They talk, right? So I was very comfortable talking to people and listening to people. And I mean, essentially what started out, I would just ask them, tell me about so-and-so. And I say this again and again, if you have family members, listen to them, take down their history, even if it doesn't become this kind of a story, because people were just so happy that I was asking to hear about their aunts or grandmothers or the patients, So one part of the reason I wanted to tell it was the nurses, women, Black women, science, erasure from history. The other part was because my grandfather had tuberculosis and he was stigmatized. And these patients were, villainized. One of the patients in the book said to me, when they offered me isoniazid, she was an African-American woman, 19 years old. I tell her story, Mimi Blair. She said, and I started getting better. I thought to myself, maybe it's better off that I die, because not only am I Black, but I have tuberculosis, and how am I going to go back into the world? So I think that contextualizes, it was an equal balance of wanting to tell the story of the patients and also of the nurses.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much to both of you. Just to reiterate, all of our gratitude and appreciation for your presence here today. Apologies that we couldn't have you in person, and again, just really grateful to have had this time in this space with both of you. Thank you very much.
Jessica, before
Thank
we have
you.
our guests leave, I just wanted to ask Ms. Allen the name of the prayer you shared at the at the end of your presentation. One of our questions in the Q&A was the name of the prayer that you shared in your presentation. And I think that's a perfect way for us to end, with the name of that prayer.
I belong to the New York State Women, and that's the collect that we speak before our meetings. And it was written by Mary Stewart in 1921. Let me see. I had my notes here. But it's called The Collect.
The Collect, Mary Stewart, 1921.
Right.
We thank you for sharing it. That was Lavia Sutton. She's a second-year doctoral student, and I wanted to make sure we got that name of that prayer for her.
Yes.
So thank you. Thank you both. And this brings us to a close of our spring spotlight. I wanted to thank Jessica and Elisa Straw, our administrator, for helping to organize this event and coordinate it. And I want to thank all of our participants as well for joining us. And we look forward to you all joining future Bates Center activities and seminars and speaker series. We look forward to engaging with you. We thank you again, Maria and Ms. Allen, and look forward to talking to you all soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.